Let's get back to City Hall now. Seattle's mayor and interim police chief speaking. Let's listen in.
In the community to undo centuries of systemic racism, I've articulated 4 key points for my vision for the city of Seattle. First, we must invest in Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. They have been underfunded for centuries, and here in Seattle, that is true as well. I will be sharing more later this month about my commitment to invest $100 million in those communities in a process that will be led by those communities. We also have been investing in young people and opportunity, which many of you have seen from our announcements this week. Furthering educational justice on the part of the Families Education and Preschool and Promise Levy. Going upstream is so critical, and education justice is a key to so many of the inequities that we see here in Seattle and across the nation. We also will be promoting accountability and reform, including statewide reforms of police unions. And finally, rethinking and reimagining policing, including Seattle Police Department's top to bottom review of culture and budget. While allowing us to meet the public safety challenges that we face in 2020, these changes also lay the groundwork for the future. We know that pending the outcome of the robust community engagement, we must respond to what community said. But we also need to act now to increase efficiency structured around Seattle Police Department's core function to respond to high volume, high priority 911 calls. Chief Diaz will go into further details, but at a high level, the Seattle Police Department is moving 100 officers into 911 response. This includes some officers from other specialty units. This augmentation will quickly give us the ability to respond to 911 calls on a more rapid basis. One thing I've heard from both officers and community members is that officers don't have the time they need to know the residents and businesses of the neighborhoods they serve, and many times it's because they are responding from call to call to call. And their time is just too fast to spend what they need to do, let alone answer priority 2 calls. Chief Diaz's announcement is furthering the goals to better align the culture of SPD and be focused on communities and neighborhood engagement. He is also increasing the number of patrol shifts. He knows that on his list of priorities is reducing the overtime budget and increasing supervisory accountability for every hour of overtime. With more officers working shorter shifts, SPD will be able to secure some savings in overtime. Today's action also laid the groundwork for future changes to the Seattle Police Department. These will be guided by an inclusive community input. Again, we're working with City Council to see if we can have a joint process for that engagement, but we need to listen to communities from throughout Seattle to make sure that in the next generation of Seattle policing really serves this city in the ways they need to be served. Over the summer, Chief Diaz and the command staff have been looking intentionally at SPD's budget and staffing. I've always believed that we need to have the right resources in place for both patrol and specialty units. We need to have a police department that can respond to the needs they have and fund that. This is an important effort to ensure the department is better positioned to smartly manage its overtime budget. If you can put more officers at the key times, you'll need less overtime. And by adding more shorter shifts, the department also is giving the necessary support and relief that those officers need, some of them working very long shifts under very heavy duty. Optimizing the role of patrol officers and creating a community safety focus for patrol officers is a critical step in reimagining what policing is. It's clear that there is a need for police in our city. We know we still need police. We rely on them to provide community safety. But we also want to make sure that the police are dealing with those issues that the police should be dealing with. One of the most important steps we'll be taking with community and with the department is to be looking really at what are those one of the 800,000 911 calls that we receive. Which of those demand a traditional armed police response, and which could get a different response? Every call for help doesn't necessarily need an armed police officer, But every call for help has to be answered by someone who is trained and who is available 24/7 to give that assistance. Scaling up those resources will be the challenge that we have to face as a city. So today's announcement is just part of our ongoing work to redirect police to where they're needed the most, and that's towards the scenes of violence and our high-priority calls. As Chief Best and I and Chief Diaz highlighted a few weeks ago, in Seattle, like so many cities across America, we are experiencing an increase in gun violence, both shootings and homicides this year. This year in King County, there's been a 44% increase in fatal shootings and a 16% increase in non-fatal shootings. And all too often, these shootings impact people of color, particularly young people of color. I've talked to Chief Diaz and before him Chief Best on highlighting everything we can do to interrupt this cycle of violence. One incident of gun violence is too many, and today's actions by SPD will be a help so the department can arrive at scenes more quickly, give victims the help they need, and help first responders and help find perpetrators. But we know that policing alone cannot and will not solve these problems or the crisis of gun violence in America. We have to increase our investments in upstream solutions like education, affordable housing, wealth building. We need tools to keep guns off the street, and we also have to disrupt the violence. And we need to work with trusted community partners who can both de-escalate situations and help provide alternatives to the criminal justice system. At the city, we invest $7.5 million this year in 27 different youth programs that are focused on disrupting violence, building healthy communities, and mobilizing youth for something positive. We actually have further increased our investment this coming year. I am really grateful to the communities in Seattle who continue to remind us that policing cannot be the only response to gun violence. We have to invest upstream, proactively, holistically, in community-based solutions. That's what will truly make a difference. And those are the exact types of investments that I intend to expand in the coming 2021 budget, which I'll be presenting later this month. I want to thank Interim Chief Diaz for stepping into this role with enthusiasm and grace, particularly during this really unprecedented and uncertain times. And with that, I'll be happy to turn this over to Chief Diaz, and when he's finished with his remarks, we'd be happy to take questions. Thank you. Chief?
Thank you, Mayor. Actually, thank you, Mayor, for your investments into the BIPOC communities, and thank you for the investments in all sorts of areas that actually reduce a lot of areas of crime. So appreciate all that support. And also thank you for your continued support for ensuring SPD has the personnel to quickly respond to emergency calls, solve problems, and work with the community to achieve public safety. The core mission of the Seattle Police Department is preventing and responding to criminal behavior. This work done in large part by the officers responding to 911 calls in our patrol bureau. These folks who risk their lives every day responding to calls for help, calls where it isn't always clear where they're going to encounter when they arrive. When an emergency is happening, people call 911 and they expect a first responder to get there fast. If it's a crime in progress, they especially want a police officer. Throughout my career, when the department was growing, when the new problems were arising, when emerging research pointed to new models, SPD responded by creating specialty units at the cost of our 911 response. This was understandable. Departments across the nation were doing the same thing. And as a result, we currently have the fewest number of officers in 911 in recent memory. But considering current personnel, budget, and other realities, these specialty units are a model we can no longer afford. So today, I'm announcing an initial step to enhance our 911 response capacity. Working with our command team and the unions, we're redeploying 100 personnel into 911 response. in almost every neighborhood city over each of the past 5 years on one of the top, if not the top concerns expressed by thousands of community members in our public safety survey has been a lack of police presence or capacity. These moves will begin to address this concern, and they will bring vital backup to patrol officers who have been racing from call to call too often. There is more to this than having more cars on the street or getting to emergency calls faster. One of my primary goals as chief is to reinvent what community engagement looks like for this police department. It is tough to engage community from inside a car, but when you're going from call to call, that's really the only option that we have. By focusing our resources on patrol, I intend our officers to identify an underlying issue and start the connection with the renter, the homeowner, the neighborhood watch, the small business owner, the person living outside, the deep and lasting connections that we know build trust, legitimacy, and lasting public safety. As chief, my commitment is to ensure we put our resources where it is most needed. Right now, that is patrol. My goal is to have at least half our police officers in patrol plus their supervisors. This will help us more completely deliver the neighborhood-based style of policing we intended for the micro-community policing plans. It will mean more officers available throughout the day, which will help achieve response time goals, reduce the overtime we use to guarantee we have enough officers on patrol, and ensure we can respond to calls of any nature. With more appropriate staffing in patrol, we will not have to rely on overtime-funded emphasis patrols to address emerging crime issues. This was a move to address an immediate and ongoing staffing need in patrol. I and the entire SPD command staff remain committed to community-driven process for determining the future roles and responsibilities of patrol and other parts of this department. And thank you. With any questions?
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Chief. As a quick reminder to everyone who is asking a question today, we will be doing follow-ups, but please keep your questions short and succinct so we can get to everybody. Our first question today will come from Hannah Scott, Cairo Radio. Hannah, the floor is yours.
Patrol seems to run counter to what some community groups and the Seattle Council leaders had in mind. I'm curious how you anticipate the council responding to this move.
Hannah, we missed the first part of that. Do you mind just repeating it? You were muted for the first part.
Sure thing, no problem. This plan to beef up the patrol seems to run counter to what some community groups and some Seattle Council leaders had in mind. How would you anticipate the council responding to this move?
I actually think the council will respond very positively. We've been working with them, and I think that uniformly across every neighborhood and community, if we look at the surveys we take as well as what our engagement with community is, people want to make sure they can have a rapid response and that they have police officers that know the community. And this is a first step in moving that direction.
Hannah, follow up.
Just quickly, this again for either of you. With yesterday's actions at Cal Anderson Park, as well as the response to a group of protesters near the East Precinct last night, it seems as though the overall response is a little bit different than some of what we had been seeing when the CHOP was around and more recently after that. Anything you can comment as far as the response and strategy right now?
Yeah, I'll let the chief address that first and then maybe do some follow-up.
So, Hannah, actually, that's a great question. Right now, at Cal Anderson, we assisted Parks Department in securing several buildings that had been occupied and been used as stations for some of the different demonstrations. We served a warrant on a tent that had multiple spike strips, knives that we've recently posted online, and shields that were being used at different demonstrations, as well as an unexploded mortar that was also recovered in the actual tent as well. Last night, we had a little bit of a hands-off approach. We had about 50 to 75 anarchists that approached and occupied the intersection, threw combustible material over the fence that we have put up as a barrier to ensure that our precinct doesn't get burned down. And then they ended up lighting 2 Molotov cocktails, which burned for a little bit. Right now, a couple of community members actually put out those fires, and so we are trying to respond to addressing any issue that comes about. At the Cal Anderson location, we earlier in the day, we actually made an arrest of somebody that was wanted out of Portland, was wanted for an assault on a firefighter, a Portland firefighter. And so we know that we are seeing some connections in relation to Portland, and then the type of materials that were actually recovered. We do have information that some of this is going to be used against us, and so we're trying to ensure that the safety of our community, ensure the safety of our officers as well.
Thank you, Chief. And I'll just follow up that. I think it's really important at the very first press conference that then Chief Best and I had with community members in May, after the protests and turned violent in downtown Seattle, we've made it really clear we as a city will protect First Amendment rights. We will do everything we can to support and promote those who are exercising their right to protest and protest peacefully. But those who do unlawful actions will be held accountable, and that has been our posture all along. It will continue to be the posture of the city of Seattle.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Chief. Our next question will come from Paul Kiefer, CS for Crank, followed by Patrick Quinn, Como. Paul, the floor is yours.
Hi, this is actually for Chief Diaz. How do you anticipate these transfers affecting ongoing casework by the specialty units, by detectives?
So this does not impact our violent crimes units. This is mostly focused on, patrol. So we're almost 40% are actually coming from units that are already doing similar patrol function, like our anti-crime team, our community policing team, and we're also moving our traffic enforcement. The vehicle side is actually going back into patrol. So there are units that are already kind of doing similar work, but we're actually focused more on the 911 response. When it comes to some of the detective units, we are taking different parts of each of the different sections, from elder crimes, from our sex offender detail. We're taking one-offs to make sure that it doesn't impact our ability to respond to those types of calls and investigate those types of incidences. So we're just downsizing certain units by creating just 1 people or 2 people in each of the units, so that doesn't create a huge impact overall in the department.
Thank you, Chief. Follow up.
Yeah, do you expect that this will impact the number of officers who retire this year, especially given that some detectives who haven't been in the field will be asked to be out in the field again?
We've actually reviewed the list of officers that are impacted. Right now, many of those officers, because of our contract and how it's worded, it is last one in, first one out. So many of the officers that are in those units are actually some of our younger detectives. So I believe that they will stay with us. So many of those officers have just recently left patrol within the last year and a half to go to those detective units. So we're hoping that they will stay and that they will continue to serve our city.
Chief.
And Paul, I just want to follow up on that. The one thing that Chief did mention is he is going to be looking very carefully at whether there is impact as we move this, what happens with that detective work with case clearance, and we'll be working closely with King County Prosecutor's Office and others to make sure that we aren't seeing negative impacts on that front. But it's a really good question and one up front that we're going to be watching.
Thank you, Mayor. Our next question will come from Patrick Quinn, Como, followed by Jake Goldstein, writing for Capitol Hill, Seattle. Patrick, the floor is yours.
This question is for the chief, but Mayor, feel free to chime in afterwards. So 100 more officers would mean more engagement with those in the community and oftentimes very tense circumstances. Obviously, in the last few months, engagement with police officers has been a point of contention in terms of safety of your officers and the public. Are you worried this could lead to more conflict?
No, I think having officers out being able to handle 911 responses. So we're actually adding a shift that is a 3 p.m. to 1 a.m. shift. They will actually work 4 days on, 3 days off. This shift will actually give officers a little bit more time off to actually rest and recuperate. It's also the highest point of our call load, and so having more officers to be able to respond to 911 calls are actually reduce the amount of actual time that they're able, that they're handling 911. If we added another 50 officers in each of those, in each of that watch, it actually reduces the amount of calls that they're responding to on a daily basis. So it actually increases some level of their safety.
Patrick, follow up.
Yeah, any steps are you taking to ensure less confrontation? I don't know if that means increasing training for these officers or these 100 officers or de-escalation measures or any proactive steps as you put them into the field that can help ensure that there is less conflict?
Yeah, you raise a good point on some of our training. As I think over the last several years, we have actually put all of our officers through all the training. They go through everything the same. So it doesn't matter if you're a patrol officer or a detective. You are going through de-escalation training, crisis intervention training. Many of the officers that have been our detectives have once gone through that crisis intervention training. For the detectives that have been away from patrol, we're actually updating their training, and depending on how long that they've been away from patrol, we will actually include the areas that they need to fill, so it makes it safe for their response to these calls for service. But right now you also have a good portion that are already currently able to respond to 911 calls, such as your traffic enforcement, your anti-crime teams, and your CPT teams. They're already doing the training that I just described as well.
I think, Patrick, one follow-up I think that on that is, if I understood your question, I think it's really important that people understand is when people dial 911 and we need a police officer there, they want them there. And that's in every part of our city. And we have not seen, unless the chief, you can correct me, we have not seen hostility to officers who are responding to calls for help. And so I think it's one of the things that may get lost in some of the coverage is that throughout Seattle, in every community, people still need and rely upon their police officers to respond to emergencies.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Chief. Our next question will come from Jake Goldstein, Capitol Hill, Seattle, followed by Simone Alicea, KNKS. Jake, the floor is yours.
This question's for Chief Diaz. So I was wondering how you say, this move is to build better community engagement and how you reconcile that with building a wall around the East Precinct that literally closes it off from the community and how you see those working in tandem.
So one is actually because you have more officers in patrol, they're actually frees up their what we call available time. And so that available time hopefully will get us to about 40% of their time in patrol is actually available to connect with community. You raise a good point. I would love to not have a wall around the East Precinct. I know that it creates a barrier for people to feel connected. However, over the last several weeks, people have they've lit a Molotov cocktail inside the lobby. They've had multiple different fires set in and around that building, on the outside of that building. And even last night, they had 2 Molotov cocktails that they threw trying to light that building on fire. And once that building does ignite, it impacts that whole block. So there's a huge safety issue that we have to contend with. And so I would love it one day to not have those blocks there, and I hope that will come soon. But right now, it's unfortunate that we're at this place where people are using a movement to actually create and commit violence.
Jake, follow up.
Yeah, also still for Chief Diaz. Other questions have kind of gotten at this, but can you talk about, we're now in the 3rd month or 4th month of demonstrations and how you think your strategy for dealing with that is shifting at all?
I think honestly, many of the demonstrations that we're having on a daily basis are actually requiring less response. And even as of last night, while there was a group that occupied and did throw Molotov cocktails, you didn't see the police around, making sure they were monitoring them or moving the crowd into some confrontation. We were actually taking a very hands-off approach. A part of that is we have many demonstrations that are occurring that don't even have a police response at all. And I think once we get to that level, we're not right now. Portland is still experiencing a nightly demonstration with violence throughout their time, and we're actually seeing less of that confrontation. But however, we're still seeing that confrontation occur at times, and so we just have to make sure that we are prepared. But we just want to make sure that everybody is safe at the end of the time.
Great, thank you, Chief. Our next question will come from Simone Alicea, KNKX, followed by Kevin Schofield, SCC Insight. And I have to announce that those will be our final two questions, as we need to stop after that. So, our next question from Simone. The floor is yours.
Hi, this is for Chief Diaz. I'm sorry if I missed this, but what is exactly the timeline on this switch? Is this immediate? We're going to see more uniformed officers out starting now?
Yes, within hopefully the next several weeks, actually within about a 2-week period, we're going through the process now, honoring the contract and giving people the opportunity for the choices of their assignments, and which is something that we have to do as part of their contract, and then they'll be immediately deployed 2 weeks after that time frame. So we're hoping around the week of the 16th as a projected time frame of September 16th.
Follow-up?
You mentioned that, or Mayor Durkin mentioned that you're going to be watching what happens with the how this affects detective work in some of those special units. I'm curious, what other metrics are you going to be looking for to determine whether this is a successful move?
Right now, officers are handling calls for service. They're handling multiple calls for service. So their call loads are getting to rates that we need to reduce that level. So that is one metric that for just the patrol officers that we're measuring. So we want to make sure we reduce that level of stress, because the higher levels of stress for officers could create impacts as far as confrontation. So we want to make sure we reduce that. But when it comes to detective work, we're going to actually we've set up a database to identify how many of the caseloads of detectives, how big those caseloads are, what the time is that they're actually getting charges or filings sent through. And so those are all aspects that we're going to be measuring to ensure that our cases are actually being filed on a timely basis. And that's the reason why we didn't abrogate complete units either, because if we would have abrogated a complete unit for example, maybe a domestic violence unit, we would have had significant impacts to the community, and that's not what we did. We were very diligent on what units we could pick from without making sure that it impacted our case filings. So
Thank you, Chief. And our last question today will come from Kevin Schofield, SCC Insight. Kevin, the floor is yours.
Thank you. This question for both the Chief and the Mayor. The recent OIG report on crowd control weapons suggested that the East Precinct building's architecture itself makes it difficult to defend. And now you sort of responded to that in part by building a concrete wall around it. Are you looking at whether the East Precinct should move to a different building that's more appropriate and potentially more defensible than the one that's currently in?
I'll start with that, and then I'll let the Chief follow. Thank you, Kevin, for the question. So the OIG report I thought was a really good report, went through a lot of factors. Your short question is there's no plan right now to move the East Precinct. We're still assessing and reviewing all of the OIG's recommendations. For example, the OIG recommended very strongly that there be better, more pronounced communication at demonstrations and protests so that people could hear a disbursement order. Chief Diaz is working with FAS and others to see if we can get sound systems that can be heard more. It's all right when you have small groups like yesterday, but when you get large crowds that are very active themselves. So we're looking at that. I want to come back to the wall, though. I could not agree more with Chief Diaz. I hate seeing the wall around the East Precinct and the West Precinct. I hate seeing public buildings having to be fenced off in a park that's in the heart of our city. But we unfortunately are in a situation now where time and time again there have been acts of violence that are very dangerous to those police. And you can either do one of two things. You can station police around it to be the defense mechanism, which we saw what happened with that. Escalation of violence night after night after night, and police then having to go and interact with the crowds. Or you put a wall for a short period of time. But this chief knows, and that we are going to be looking at this very carefully to see how quickly we can reintegrate that department, both visually and physically, with the community that it serves.
You've hit it. So.
Okay.
Great. Opportunity for a follow-up, Kevin?
Yeah, thank you. Yesterday, a judge in the Shea Taylor wrongful death suit cleared the case to go to trial potentially fairly quickly. Given the tensions around police violence locally and nationally and the strong views on both sides about police, over-policing and police violence, do you have any concerns about whether it's possible to seat a jury that could objectively decide this case?
Yeah, Kevin, I think that's a great question, and I was able to read your analysis on the judge's ruling yesterday. I've not yet been able to talk to the city attorney to have his assessment of where the case is, when it could be heard. Having tried high-profile cases in the past, it's really a difficult burden to move a case. But I think for a lot of reasons, not just whether you could seat a jury, but in the end, what is going to be the right thing for the police department, the city of Seattle moving forward. So I have to talk to Pete Holmes about that. He's been in the driver's seat on that case, and I've not been fully briefed yet.
Thank you very much. And Q&A is now concluded, so we'll turn it over to you for closing thoughts.
Chief, I'm going to let you do some, and then I'll wrap up.
No, I honestly just want to say thank you. We know this is not easy for, moving 100 officers back into patrol because, we're uprooting different units and different people's schedules, but it's the right thing for us to do. Patrol has been the backbone of our department, and this is our reflection to make sure that they have the staffing, that they're able to respond to calls for service, that they're able to get there in a fast and timely manner, and they're being able to address the safety issues that we're confronted with on a daily basis. So we're excited that we're able to have enough officers to be able to do that, but we also have to make sure that we evaluate all the impacts that could occur down the road as far as our investigation side, and as well as what are impacts that might have when it comes to our training and our consent decree. So these are all things that we're evaluating, and we're excited to move this forward at this time.
Thank you. And I want to thank Chief Diaz for being willing to step up and, again, give great gratitude to Chief Best for all the service she's given for decades. I also want to just take a moment to remind people and root us in how we got here and why we are reimagining policing. Rightfully so, we spent a lot of time talking about the First Amendment rights of demonstrators and how we respond to those demonstrations. But let's not lose sight as to why people were demonstrating in the first instance. I am committed, long-term and short-term, to make sure that we in Seattle can get policing right and make the right investments in community. We know that we have to go upstream to really disrupt the cycle of violence. It's why we will be doing more in my budget and why I look forward to engaging with community to see what will work. The increase in gun violence is unacceptable, and too many of the victims are young men of color. We have to stop that cycle too. And the best way to do it is scaled investments in things like education justice, access to affordable housing, access to health care, and then having trusted community partners who know families, know young people, and can keep them engaged. Second, we want to make sure that as we're looking at policing, we don't just budget to a number. We actually ask ourselves, what is it we want police to do? And then we build that model and fund that model. At the same time, what do we need other people to do? And how do we scale that to a point where if someone really needs help and they call 911, it won't matter where they live or what time of day it is, someone can respond who's trained in the work they do and who can actually help. This is going to take some time and some process, and it can't happen without the involvement of community. So I look forward over the coming months to really talk about what does policing look like, but as important, the $100 million that we are committed to spending, how does community think we need to spend that money? Center the voice of communities of color, indigenous communities who have been left behind in every regard, not just in Seattle, but across this country. I mean, still today, a kid growing up in South Park, Seattle, doesn't have the life expectancy, the career expectancy that a kid in Laurelhurst does. We're better than that. We have to change that. So I look forward in the months to come to really building a more equitable Seattle, and that as we move through COVID, which is still the #1 threat to our city, that we come back not just the same, but we come back stronger and more equitable. And on that point, one last thing that you'll be hearing, this is back to school. And usually back to school means kids got their, their new book bags, parents are sending them off, parents know that they've got their kids in a safe place for certain hours of the day. But because of COVID and because of the botched response, schools won't be opening. And as a result, the kids who are going to suffer the most are the kids of color in our Seattle public schools. I talked to Denise Juneau last week. We're working very closely with them to see what strategies the city of Seattle can do through its levy and other tools to help make sure the kids don't fall further behind, that they have a device so they can connect to the internet, that they have access to the internet, and that they have somebody engaged with them that can help them through their studies. All of these things have to work together. So today we're talking about policing, but policing has become the big net that catches all the other failures in our society. And it's my duty as mayor, and I think our duty as a city, to figure out how we do better on that regard. Thank you very much, and happy September to everyone.
You've been watching live coverage of Seattle's mayor and interim police chief discussing a day of changes in the police department. Chief Carmen Best has officially retired now. Adrian Diaz is now the police chief until the city finds a permanent replacement. Diaz says the focus on the department will be patrol and 911 response. As a result, starting this week, the department is going to start moving 100 officers and supervisors out of specialty units and into the 911 response team. The interim chief says they can no longer afford current staffing in those specialty units. Chief Diaz says his goal is to have more than half of police officers and supervisors on patrol in neighborhoods to boost response times and connections to communities. In addition, they're going to change schedules to put officers on shorter shifts. That will help cut back on their overtime costs. The mayor says they're also going to review which 911 calls need a police officer and which ones need other trained professionals to respond. Chief Diaz says one of his goals is to reinvent what community engagement and policing looks like.